Hi, I'm Petr Kucheryavy, Senior Manager on the Accessibility Center of Excellence team at Spectrum. I'd like to take a little time today to talk about the business case for accessibility. Specifically, I'd like to zero in on the motivators for disability inclusion. Taking a quick step back, let's look at the current landscape of disabilities in the United States. We know that according to census data and other survey findings, approximately 1 in 5 people in the United States identifies as having a disability. These are apparent and non-apparent disabilities. And while this number is significant, I'd like over the next several minutes to demonstrate why the effective number that we should be focusing on is actually much larger than that 20%. I'll start with a concept called universal design. For those of you who aren't familiar, universal design really focuses on a fundamental principle that states that when you build a product or service or an environment, people with disabilities and the needs of people with disabilities should be considered from the start, into the main product, into the main environment. That is not an additional plug-in or add-on, but considered from ideation onward. I'll give a couple examples that will hopefully drive this point home and can be relatable for others. One of these is curb cuts that we find out on streets. Curb cuts were designed to solve a very specific problem for people who use wheelchairs. However, when curb cuts began to be implemented, we found that a much broader population of people were actually benefiting from having these curb cuts, especially those who were pushing bikes, strollers, pulling luggage, or had very small kids. Also, things like Siri. Now, Siri was initially designed to solve a problem for those who needed greater ease of access for technology and for whom just using a voice to execute certain functions or navigate applications would be much easier. Now, today we use Siri voice assistant for everyone and we all benefit from it. So we're starting to see already how something like universal design takes us from that 20% and allows us to creep farther out beyond that number and benefit a much greater population of people. We know that when we build a product for people with disabilities, we build a better product for everyone. Also, there's something called network currency. So what this means is that it's not just a person with a disability that we're considering in terms of loss of business. For instance, if I as a blind person enter an establishment that uses a kiosk to initiate a certain service or to order a product, and that kiosk interface is not designed in a way that allows me to access it non-visually, the establishment or the business will lose my business, but also could potentially lose the business of my network. Perhaps a spouse, a relative, or a friend will say to themselves, I don't want to go to an establishment that isn't welcoming to my friend or my brother or my husband or whatnot. And so you start to see a loss of business from the network of each individual that's being alienated from this particular service or product. Also, if a person, let's say in a wheelchair, is going out to lunch with their coworkers and a particular restaurant has not built in the right ADA features to allow them to enter into the place of business, then that group is going to pick a different restaurant to frequent. And so you're seeing a much greater loss of business, not just from the individual who uses the wheelchair, but also the network of folks that are around them. So I won't speculate on what those numbers look like, but I will say that when you count up the number of individuals that are part of the network of each person that has a disability, it's going to be much larger than just the 20%. And finally, I want to focus in on a very, very important topic that we should be considering, especially now in the 21st century. And that is the increase of baby boomers entering into the over 65 demographic. We know that there's somewhere to the tune of 10 million people a day entering into the over 65 bracket. Why this is important, because if you isolate just that demographic of over 65, you start to see that the numbers of people with disabilities isn't just 20%, it's now somewhere around 40%. And if you tighten up that gap toward the top and look at folks that are over 70 or 80 years old, then you start to see that number creep closer and closer to 100%. That is, the older we get, the more likely we are to experience a disability, like a cognitive impairment, vision impairment, mobility impairment, and so on. So it becomes really important for us to think about how we're building our environments, how we're building our academic spaces or our products, because the number of people that are going to be affected is going to continue to increase from 20% greater and greater. Not only that, we also have the consideration of the network, as we mentioned, and also the unintended benefits to those who don't have disabilities. We haven't talked at all today about legal motivators, but that's because I don't think that they're very effective. Perhaps they're effective at starting the conversation or creating that initial jolt, but I think true innovation and creativity comes from designing spaces, products, environments for a better user experience for all. Thank you so much for joining me today.